There once was a cashier by the name of Karl Hoeker, who was 34 years old when the war ended. Since that time, he has lived in a small villa in Engershausen, in the district of Lübeck, where he was chief cashier of the district savings bank. A respected citizen. Of medium height and thin dark hair, he was entrusted with sizable amounts of money. His hobby was gardening. And this is from a Journey Through a Haunted Land from Amos Elon, and it was published in 1966. I'm waiting for that. In 2014, I stood bent over thousands of files, copies of originals, copies of copies of copies, gathered from archives of different countries and even continents, sometimes brought in by those who visited the archive, and often, of course, collected by the museum itself. One file stood out to me. It had obviously been copied numerous times before it found its way to Washington, D.C., where the archive was situated. I realized I had seen the document before, in the City Archive of Lübeck, Germany, in a better version than the one I saw here. It read, Karl Hoeker, 11/12/11. Something, probably his identification card, had once been copied at the bottom of the paper and was still visible, but no further information could be retrieved. The document fascinated me. An attempt to preserve as much information as possible, and in itself revealing the impossibility to fully archive history. Okay, so now I will read a little bit from the book. In 2007, I saw the photographs for the first time. I remember one picture in particular that struck me. It showed men and women chatting and relaxing while resting on canvas chairs on a wooden porch. In the foreground, a man in uniform was sitting in one of the chairs. 4 women were resting in the chairs next to him. The photograph was shown in different versions in various media. It was mostly reproduced in brownish sepia tone, but I also saw it published in black and white, sometimes cut off, sometimes with the deckled edges of the original printed photo still visible. The image belonged to an album which was anonymously donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in 2007, and is nowadays referred to as the Hoeker album. To this day, the Hoeker album is the only known photographic album which shows the everyday life and leisure time of Nazis who worked in the concentration camps Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. The image just described is part of a series of pictures that was taken at the so-called Solarhütte, a cottage which was a popular holiday destination due to its beautiful surrounding landscape. The album itself contained very little information about the men and women shown in the 116 photographs. Eventually, the owner of the album was identified as Karl Friedrich Hoeker, SS Obersturmführer and adjutant to Richard Beer, the last commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp. The photographs reveal the relationships of high-ranking officers and auxiliary personnel. They show the people who are depicted living a normal life, detached from the horrendous crimes they committed. One of them was Karl. So I actually decided to, in this talk, to read from the book because, as you can see, text is quite important in the work. And this was one short extract from In Letters of Karl, and it was published in 2015 by FW Books, and the design is by Hans Gremmen. And there are additional texts from Christoph Busch and Raymond Franken. And as I mentioned earlier, the project also is made in an installation. So in this presentation, I want to talk about the content of the work, obviously, but also about the realization of the project and the collaboration between the different individuals and archives. It took in discovering more information about the Hoeker album. And so a little bit in general about the work. In Matters of Color, it's a research project, and the starting point of the work is the photo album of images Karl Hoeker collected during the war. And to be precise, the images were taken between May 1944 until the end of 1944, just weeks before the evacuation of the camp. And actually the victim of the perpetrators who are depicted on the images are never shown. So one layer of the work is obviously about the historic events surrounding the images and the history after the war concerning Karl Hoeker. And another layer is about how the information is or is not attainable. And sometimes, of course, it is gone simply because of the passage of time. And sometimes it is kept from us by family, for instance, who don't want to share information. Or it is, as in this case, scattered around different archives in different countries and even different continents. And sometimes, also as in this case, information resurfaces unexpectedly. Another layer, which is the distribution of information, and that is a layer that's very important in the book, is of reproduction. How does information change when an image, for instance, is reproduced in different forms and altered due to the reproduction? So the different layers are actually held together by my personal story, which is narrated almost as a diary, and it's in chronological order, and it takes the audience through the project in the course of the research and doubts I have and choices I made. And in the work, I don't focus on the entire album. As I've said, it consists of 116 photographs in total. But I focused on 31 images, which were taken at the Solarhütte. And the cottage had actually specifically been built to be used for recreational needs by the Nazis who worked in Auschwitz. And it was built by prisoners of the camp when it had just been established in 1940. And the Nazis, a lot of people don't think about this, but of course they had free time, but they were not allowed to engage with the Polish population. That's why they had to think of something to do. And the cottage was one of those things they built. So in 2007, when I saw those images, I became very interested in the site, and I started researching and eventually contacted the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. And thanks to them, I learned about the location and that the cottage was actually still there. And the Solarhütte was still there, in its original state. And to my astonishment, it was still used as a holiday location where people could spend the night, have a beer, and enjoy the sun out on the terrace. The history of the place was known, as the receptionist told me, but there were no visual reminders of the past, except for the cottage itself. So I will explain a little bit more about this later on. So this is the cottage in 2007. So you see a big gap here, 2007, 8, and then 11. And there was one big stumbling block of the project, and that was myself. My father, who was born in 1940, has told me a story many times. When he was a little boy, he was immensely proud to be of German descent. At school, he had heard all about great writers like Goethe and Schiller, famous composers such as Schubert, Bach, and many others. He was glad he belonged to a culture that had brought about such great men. Little by little came the knowledge about what his fellow countrymen were also capable of, and what they had done before and during the war. Through his secret whispering with his friends, the horrible rumors soon turned out to be the truth. The teachers themselves had been involved in the crimes. So none of this he learned at school. The childlike feeling of pride forever vanished after this. The guilt and shame he felt then, and that he still feels now as a grown-up, the disgust and disbelief at what men are capable of doing to one another, have been passed on to me. The experience has not only left a profound impression on his life, but also on mine. The photographs of the album touch something deeply disturbing. They show the perpetrators in a human way, in which we would rather not see them. They remind us that under certain conditions, ordinary men and women, ourselves included, can be capable of committing such unimaginable crimes. Although still doubtful, I wanted to know more. So this was actually a big issue for me during the whole process. And you will see the original images later on, and I actually still find them really confronting. And maybe some of you even remember the discovery of the album. It was in the media worldwide. So at this point, I had been in Poland, and I wanted to find out more information about Karl. And the thing that I wanted to do mostly was find different images than the ones in the album. And that's why I really wanted to talk to his family. And I knew he had a daughter and a son. So in 2009 and 2011, I went to Lübeck, where he had lived before and after the war. And I went to the city archives, and there was actually a file about Karl, about his conviction, about the discovery of the album. And here you can see an image that actually became really important during the process. He like in most images, he's covering his face, and that's a newspaper clipping, obviously. And we found the contact sheet that goes with it. Here is the image. So here you can see the sequence, and also we repeated the image on the cover. And it's a silkscreen print, so it's slowly going away as time passes. And as the book is hopefully read very often. So at the city archives, there was a file with collected articles on Hoeker. He had been convicted various times for his war crimes. Hoeker always covered his face in the pictures, accompanying the articles. There was information where he had lived and worked before and after the war, and also about the discovery of the album. The archivist told me she knew the family, but wasn't allowed to give me their address. She explained to me how traumatized the family was. All their lives, they had been confronted with the crimes their father had committed. Yet he had never admitted to anything, and implied he had only followed orders. So there are more images like this in the book when you take a look at it, and in the installation. So he was I never got a hold of him in terms of the family wouldn't interact with me. The images I saw were like ever repeating images as this. And let me see. In 2007, my father sent me a clipping from a German newspaper, Ostfriesenzeitung, a small regional paper from where I grew up. It was an article and an image about the Hoeker album. Around the same period of time, Tilman Taube, a business administrator from Germany, saw a similar newspaper article in a different German paper with a different photograph from the album. He was quick to contact the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., where the album was kept, and got in touch with historian archivist Becky Erbelding. Taube had recognized his grandfather, Dr. Heinz Baumkötter, in the images. Baumkötter was an SS Obersturmführer during the war and was responsible for conducting medical experiments on concentration camp inmates. Since finding out about his grandfather's crimes at the age of 19, Tilman had made tireless effort to find more information on the biography and crimes of his grandfather. In Belgium, Christoph Busch, a criminology expert interested in collective violence and then working at a psychiatric institution, also saw the images. Busch privately started to do research on the album, and eventually, in 2011, our path crossed. Christoph and I had a common interest. How could seemingly normal people end up doing what the people on the images had done? And how could we, nowadays, be so sure about our own immunity? And as I told you before, I was hitting a little bit of a wall in terms of getting information, especially images, of course, and it was simply scattered over many archives, and for me at that point, the most important source of information would have been the family, and they declined. And actually, at first, I didn't even have their address. When I walked through town, nobody would give it to me. And actually, Christoph, he found out the address, and I contacted the family, but they absolutely didn't want to cooperate. So this is an extract from a phone call that I had with the husband of the daughter. And he said, when my father-in-law died in 2000, we finally had peace. We don't want to talk about it anymore. So that was, for me, a real turning point in the process, because I knew I would never get information from that source. And so the interest in the context really brought Christoph and Tilman and myself together from very different backgrounds. And it provided a lot of benefit for the three of us, for each other. And actually, Tilman was very active on an internet forum, Access History, it's called, and it's where amateur researchers and professional researchers and archivists gather information about specifically the period of World War II. And actually, a lot of the identifications from the Hoeker album were made within this really simple-looking forum. I can show you an image later on. Okay, that's really fast going. Okay, so I have to go a little bit faster then. So together, actually, with Tilman and Christoph, the three of us went to Poland again in 2011, and this is actually an archive in Majdanek in the east of Poland, and this is an image that's really important to me, because often the information was just as it is here. You can see there is information, but you simply can't get to it. And I want to talk a little bit about the design of the book. So Hans Gremmen, the designer, and I really wanted to emphasize that there sometimes is no information, some information is not attainable, it is scattered, so you simply don't have images for everything you would want to have images for. So that's why we decided to do the varnish layer. which you can actually feel in the book. It brings texture. And here you can see it. It goes throughout the book. And obviously it leaves space for different kinds of information on the page. So my personal story goes throughout the book. And then you could use images which are in connection with each other. And also you can have cross-references if you want to have more information on, for instance, this particular topic. Then you can look in the back of the book and find out more if you want to. Okay. So in 2011, as I just said, we went back to Poland, and the solar hut had actually just been demolished, and it became a really metaphor for the project, for what I had encountered the whole time. I have to cut it a little bit short. In 2014, I went to Washington, D.C., and I finally saw the original album. And it's actually kept in separate folders and pages. And the hardcover was already missing when it was donated to the museum. And I actually had been struggling with how to implement the images the whole time. And because I didn't want to show them anymore. But of course they are a really important part of the project. But then I found they had made copies of the original images when they found out it's such an important document. So as a few people as possible touch it. But actually on the copies you can see how the original page looks like. So you can see, for instance, water and insect damage. And the original order of the album was put back by looking at the water and insect damage. Also, you can see the series of pictures. And for instance, in this case, here you have deckled edges, and you also have straight edges. And in this case, the deckled edges, those images were taken by a professional photographer. I'll go a little bit quick, so this is the image I was talking about in the beginning. And those are the images as they're provided by the museum and usually used in newspapers, for instance, or in different media. And this is an image that's really important, and I will just read that as a finishing. 31 of the 116 photographs from the Hoeker album were taken at the Solar Hütte on probably 2 different occasions. One series was taken July 22nd, 1944, and shows Hoekers alongside SS Helferin, female guards, during an excursion to the cottage. Another series was taken at the end of July 1944, possibly July 29. Rudolf Höss was commandant of Auschwitz from 1941 until 1943, but had returned to the concentration camp in 1944 in order to carry out the so-called Operation Höss. Between May and July 1944, approximately 430,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to the camps and murdered almost immediately upon arrival. The images at the Solar Hütte probably show Höss farewell after completing the operation. The images taken at the tavern show highly ranked SS officers, such as Höss himself, but also Josef Mengele, Otto Moll, Richard Beer, Josef Kramer, and of course Karl Hoeker, amongst others. These photographs are the only known visual records of some of these men in Auschwitz. The date of the second series was established by the identification of Anton Thurmer, who is seen in a number of images. After the evacuation of Majdanek concentration camp where he had worked, he only visited Auschwitz for a short period of time. So an image like this can actually provide really new information, and also in a court case, for instance, you can place people when they've said they have not been there because there's simply no evidence anymore. And of course, the Nazis tried to destroy documents as much as possible. So even though at the discovery the war had ended more than 60 years ago, they can still bring a lot of new information, and as I think, also for the present and the future. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing this journey with us. It's been quite a long and lengthy process to do the research that it takes to tell stories are not maybe told at first glance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To find the connections and the missing parts.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I think one big thing why it took so long was I didn't want to let go of any of the layers. I found the historical information really important, but I was also fascinated by the reproduction and, of course, my personal story and so on. So I really didn't want to let go of any of the layers. So I was really fortunate to work with Hans and to get it
to find a form that
fit perfectly, I think. And actually, we also tried, for instance, this is a reference, of course, to the brown archival boxes. So it goes on and on referencing.
Yeah. There are many different inroads, of course, to this project, but one thing that I find really striking is how obvious it becomes the things that are missing and the shame involved with maybe not wanting to look at certain parts of history that you highlight in such a specific way. And if we think then about the things that are happening now and future generations, do you see people erasing tracks in similar ways? Is this a...
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Can you give any
I can't give an example out of my head at the moment, but I think the importance of the image is that we have to ask ourselves what we would do. And of course, at the moment, there are many situations in many different countries where we have to ask ourselves,
what are we doing?
Yeah. And so that's why I think the pictures remain really worth and must be looked at in that sense. But I can't, to answer your question, I can't really think of one example, but that's why I think they're so really relevant.
You mentioned that it was a difficult decision for you to actually show the photos in this book. Why was that?
Because I didn't want to give them more space, I think. For me, that felt like even giving it more of a platform in a negative way. But of course, the entire project is about the images. So, but actually, Karin, who was also the editor with me, she said, for you, you've looked at those images, they're so known to you. And because I'm so aware of the history, but of course that's not for everybody. So, but I'm glad we did incorporate them at the end and not at the very beginning of the book.
Any more questions from the audience?
Yeah, you had that big picture with a guy sitting on a swing couch, and you pointed at the bottom of the screen.
Oh, yeah,
I'll explain it later.
Yeah, I'll go back to that. Thank you. Yeah, actually, of course, this is about the archives, how information is scattered, and how also private archives are part of the history, but not necessarily, it's not necessarily collected by a museum. And of course, my own images became part of the ever-growing archive. So that's why we incorporated earlier images or images, that gives a different version of the same place in the book.
So I guess you could maybe say the different layers that you included in the book are also the different roles you took on of producing content, of reproducing content, of framing it, curating it,
looking at it
looking
again
at it again.
Yeah.
All these different roles.
Yeah.
In relation to the issues at stake today, I'm curious if you position this project and the time it took you to do this work. It was a very meticulous, laborious process to be so careful. And then you have the speed, or the way you can say send a database query and maybe get back out of things in fractions of a second. Can you comment on the value of the time it took to reflect and to process these things?
For me it was extremely important, also because it just simply took time to find the right people. For instance, the images were discovered in 2007, but I only met Christoph and Tillman in 2011. So, and they really provided really important information for me that I could go on. So, and of course, I mean, all of you know you don't work constantly on something like this, so you let it sit for a while, and then you can take it back up and you have a new view on it. So I think it's really important, but on the same time, I think I'm someone who can, be like, oh, I have to let it sink in, and sometimes also really nice to be like, okay, really quick react, what do you think? And also, I think that's when you collaborate. I mean, with Hans, for instance, we just laid all the images down, and then he worked on it again, and that actually went really quick. I mean, the book was made in a matter of a few months, actually, which I hadn't expected because of the amount of time it took before. But I think both is really valuable.
Other questions?
I think in tying together all the discussions before, the question you addressed much more is the question of representation. So there's contextualization, of course, and dissemination, but representation as a question itself, I think you addressed that very much in your book, and I think that's always also part of the archival material.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
My question. Comment.